Steph Curry signs an extension with the Warriors. Is he going to retire as a Warrior? Probably. Plus, what this means for how this actually helps the Warriors more. We'll talk about the new CBA and how it's put different teams between a rock and a hard place. And we're going to preview the Southeast Division. Should be a good one here on Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On NBA, your daily source for all things NBA from the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for joining us and making us part of your day. Appreciate you guys being with us. Whether you're joining us on podcast form, make sure to give us those 5-star reviews and likes, or if you're joining us on youtube.com/LockedOnNBA, make sure to hit that subscribe button for us and give us a like there as well. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it, David?
It's game time.
It's game time. All right. On today's show, we're going to preview the Southeast Division, which is really interesting despite most of the teams being pretty mid. We will talk about the new CBA and how I have some thoughts on how the CBA is putting teams between a rock and a hard place. But we start today, David, with Steph Curry, as that's the that's pretty much the only news going on right now in the NBA, and that's just kind of how that's going. Curry signed an extension with the Golden State Warriors on last week. He signed a 1-year, $62.6 million contract extension that's going to take him through 2027, I believe. He's going to be 39 at the end of his contract. That, to me, pretty much locks up the idea that Curry's going to retire as a Warrior. I don't know how much this was ever going to be a question. I kind of had some thoughts just because the Warriors are always so kind of proactive. Like, they let Klay Thompson go, and like they're always like kind of looking to the future, and their ewnership is very progressive. So if that time comes, so I will ask you though, do you think we're going to see like an Olajuwon in Toronto or Patrick Ewing in Orlando type ending where Steph's in a different uniform, or does this pretty much lock up that Steph's going to retire as a Warrior?
I honestly don't. I think, it would be different with Olajuwon and Ewing, obviously being 7-footers, having the kind of toll that puts on your body. It was a little different. Watching them kind of try to labor through just the basics of being an NBA player was difficult to watch. So I don't think we're going to see that. I mean, I think for one, players are able to take care of their bodies a lot better. Steph has been relatively healthy over the course of his career, and I think he's a regularly sized human being. I mean, tall, obviously, but regularly sized in the sense that he's not going to have those kind of ongoing lower leg injuries that tend to bother most 7-footers as they age. Having said all that, he could have signed a 2-year extension had he waited until next offseason. Instead, he chose to just take the 1 year now. But it kind of feels like there's a finality to it. Draymond's contract ends at that same point. I think a couple other players on the roster have their contracts end around the same time. And that just might be a way for Golden State to finally clear the books and say, all right, we're going to enter into a completely new era and just move on to whatever the next phase of Golden State Warrior basketball might be. So I personally think he's going to retire a Warrior. He's accomplished a lot. He's a Hall of Fame player. Obviously, he's one of the all-time greats. There's nothing you can say about him that would detract from that. Nothing that he could do over the next 3 years that would change the course of anything he's accomplished over his career. So while he still wants to continue winning, and he said so as much recently, I still think that even if he doesn't win a championship, or if he doesn't even become a real playoff contender, he'll still stick it out in Golden State.
Yeah, for me, I thought Marcus Thompson over The Athletic did a really good job of kind of showcasing this. This, to me, is less about like rewarding Steph, quote unquote, because he was going to get paid regardless. This is more about Curry actually putting a very strong vote of confidence behind Golden State. And the reason that I think this is so interesting is it's the opposite of what LeBron has done until he got to the Lakers, where he's just given them infinite amounts of rope and slack to really no benefit since 2020. When LeBron was with the Heat and when he was with the Cavaliers in particular, he signed short-term contracts that always put pressure on the organization. Hey, if you don't improve the roster, if you don't put me in a championship contention window, I'm going to walk. I'm just going to opt out. The problem with that approach is that other players look at that and go, I'm not signing up for a 5-year deal if you're not going to be there. I'm not going to lock myself into being part of this team and getting stuck as the guy that's left over. And that was a real problem, I think, for various teams, that for various players, even like key role players that are like, well, I don't want to get stuck there. I don't want to get stuck in case LeBron leaves. And other players have taken this approach as well. So Curry locking this in to where it's basically saying like, yeah, I'm going to be here. You've got a 3-year window. I'm going to be here 3 years. That gives them the opportunity to pursue these types of deals and pursue these types of players who will know, hey, I'm going to, Steph might get a little worse as he approaches age 39, but I'm going to have Steph Curry next to me. So if they go after a Lauri Markkanen, if they go after another marquee player, if they go after various superstars that come available, because they have shopped there before, there's always going to be conversations about Giannis Antetokounmpo. There will just always be links between Golden State and their interest in Giannis, and Giannis's, I think, relative interest there as well. That opens up the window to be like, hey, you get to play with Steph Curry. Right. Also, to me, very notable that this happens after the Klay Thompson departure, that like Klay leaves and Steph says, I get it. Like, it's a business decision. They added good players like Buddy Hield and Kyle Anderson, DeAnthony Melton. They put good players around me. I believe in this team still, even though they let my longtime partner walk. So that was my big takeaway, is like, this is a vote of confidence from Steph for the Warriors.
Absolutely. But I'm trying to think, has there ever been at any point in time where this didn't feel like a foregone conclusion that Steph was going to stay throughout perpetuity with Golden State? Like, I can't recall any player, certainly not currently. I mean, maybe Giannis is close there, but of course he's still got a long career ahead of them. And I just don't know any player that is so inextricably linked to the front office and the organization as much as Steph Curry is.
I think
and it just seems like this is his team. Like, you make it seem like there was a concern from other players, like, oh, maybe Steph leaves, and I don't know if I necessarily want to go here. But at the same time, it's like, it's Steph Curry. No one's. I mean, I know somebody's flirted with the idea of him joining Charlotte. Good luck with all that. But at the same time, I just don't. I mean, this is his team, and it's been that way for a long time.
For sure. I just think that it's more of, you don't have to worry about the uncertainty. Like, you just, I think it's less about like the likelihood of it, just like, because you didn't think LeBron was going to leave Miami, and then that happened, and you didn't really think that he was going to leave Cleveland, and then that happened. And so I think that there's kind of if you're an NBA player, you want to take the sure thing as often as possible. You want the guaranteed money most years, and the assurance of those types of things. I also think that Steph I think it was possible that maybe things could have gone differently. Like, if Draymond had fallen off a cliff more dramatically, then I think that that's possible. I will say that I have like a little bit of concern, because I've kind of been in the mindset of like, Steph's going to be good forever. Like you mentioned, like the way he plays, his size, etc. However, like last season, if you look at the end of the back half of his season, there was a slide, like a real dip in terms of not just the box score numbers, but also some of the impact metrics. So I'm just very curious to see, like, was it a blip, or is this kind of the start of Steph's decline? Because if he declines at all, they have to get more aggressive, because they have to find a better player than Steph Curry now in order to be the primary guy. And that's where I think things get interesting, dramatic, and very difficult. All right, up next, I've got some thoughts on the CBA, because there's a couple teams that are kind of stuck, and it's going to cause some future problems, and I'm really curious what the league's going to do about it. We'll talk about that up next here on Locked On NBA. Today's show is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is the absolute best way for you to be able to give a great opportunity for yourself to find some curiosity again. Give online therapy a try. BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA and get on your way to being your best self. What's something you want to learn? Because as an adult, we don't take enough time, I think, to learn new things. Like, I want to learn languages. That's something I always think about, that I wish I spent more time learning languages. I actually just picked up Italian. I'm trying to figure out how to do Italian and Spanish at the same time, but it's hard to do those types of things, whether it's gardening, a new language, maybe how to finally beat your best friend in bowling. Therapy can help reconnect you with your sense of wonder, because your back to school era can come at any age. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and switch therapists at any time. for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. We'll be right back on Locked On NBA. Second segment here on Locked On NBA. Thanks for joining us. Matt Moore alongside David Ramil. You can catch David over at Locked On Heat, and he'll help me out with the Southeast Division preview later. You're interested to get his thoughts on that. You can catch me at Locked On Nuggets as well, as I cover the ongoing saga that is the Jamal Murray extension with the Nuggets. They're also facing Aaron Gordon being a free agent next summer. And I will admit that this thoughts on the CBA kind of came out of discussions with my partner, Adam Mares. He can catch on Fridays on this show about where the Nuggets are at and the complications of the Jamal Murray extension. But it also applies to a number of other teams. Brandon Ingram, and I think a number of other teams with young stars are going to be caught in this kind of situation. So the previous CBA kind of set the table. That's why we have so many players that have quote unquote max contracts. And everyone's like, he's not a max player. Why does he have a max contract? And the reality was that the players had the leverage to be like, well, I'll get it from somewhere. And so you're either going to pay me what I want or I'm going to walk. And teams were in a situation of, well, we don't want to lose him for nothing. And we are unable to trade him because of the leverage situation that we're in. So we'll just pay him and figure it out later. That's becoming so much more problematic with the new CBA, with the restrictions of the second apron and really of the first apron as well. And as well as the luxury tax, you're seeing a lot of teams be a lot more uncertain about what they want to do. Now, there's every indication that Jamal Murray is going to get the extension in Denver, that's going to happen. And he's going to get a max extension. There's not going to be it's going to be a lot of drama, quote unquote, for nothing. But Brandon Ingram in New Orleans is a situation where that one's a lot more up in the air, and we just don't know what that's going to look like. The Heat currently are in a really fascinating situation where Jimmy Butler's in an expiring contract season where both sides were like, no, it's fine. And that's really fascinating to me because teams are trying to figure out, is it worth it to limit our flexibility to lock ourselves into these players who, whether it's for age, just their overall ability, whatever, are not of the caliber of player to demand that salary and yet are so integral to the team's success. And the fact that free agency also is so lessened now with everyone taking the extensions, you can't go out and be like, well, if we lose this player, I'll just go out and get another star point guard. Can't do that anymore. Those guys aren't available. And David, to me, it's creating the situation where teams are in a real rock and a hard place. Do you want to lose a guy for nothing? Or do you want to lock yourselves into a deal that not only you're going to be overpaying, but it makes that player extremely difficult to trade? And if you have questions about that, go ask Zach LaVine how he's like in Chicago. So I just think it's a really difficult situation that this new CBA has created. And I'm starting to wonder if the league is going to have to do something in the intermediate to try and address this before the new CBA negotiations are up.
Yeah, I'm wondering what they could do. But even as you're describing it, though, I think it kind of helps some teams, maybe even a few of those teams, because I think it forces you to make a hard decision that maybe you wouldn't be willing to make. And at the same time, we've seen, as you said before, teams kind of not necessarily throw money away, but give money away somewhat haphazardly to certainly players that probably didn't, quote unquote, deserve it. That being the case, I think, you mentioned those names, those players, they're limited, either in Ingram's case, maybe in terms of what his actual ceiling might be. In Butler's case, how much longer can he continue to produce at a high level, and will he stay engaged in the regular season, et cetera? So these are legitimate questions. So while the team is kind of forced to make a tough decision, it kind of benefits them. If the player is going to be so adamant, and I absolutely believe that they should, and say, you know what, I feel I can bet on myself and get the most money possible. Well, guess what? Ultimately, a team has to kind of say, well, we don't agree. And then we'll have to kind of make a decision from that point forward that is mutually beneficial. If you can go and get that money somewhere else, good luck to them. And we've seen that before, too. Like a player kind of says, you know what? Trade me. I want to get that deal somewhere else. Somebody else is forced to pick up that tab, and it winds up burning both of them. So I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm curious as to why your overall concerns are and how the league might step in to alleviate it.
I think there's a couple of issues here. I think one, it's making it really difficult for teams to build good squads. I think it's just, there's a level of parity that the league has pursued, and I think they've accomplished it to a large degree. I think that the title is more wide open, and the fact the last 6 titles have been different, I think, is proof of that.
Yep.
But there's got to be a balance here where you don't want every team to be kind of like a mess and really incomplete. And I think it's also kind of complicating some of the things with there's fewer jobs for, I think, some of the veterans in this league. And it's why I think we've seen players, you kind of want to talk about this a little bit, like Evan Fournier just signed overseas. Like Fournier was not a good NBA player by the time that he was done, but he was serviceable.
Yes.
Patrick Beverley is overseas, just started in Israel. So you're seeing these players, kind of like the veterans, lose jobs. And that's one of the concerns that I also have from a union perspective. From the team perspective, my concern is you're having to make choices to basically be like, well, we're going to be worse, but that's better than being better and overpriced and having less flexibility. And I get what you're saying about making the teams make a choice. I get that. And it puts a more premium on developmental systems, right? Like teams that have really good developmental systems are going to be excellent. It's why Miami will probably be really good during this era, because they can just find guys through the Skyforce and always have dudes that are available to play and be the zombie heat. But I think a lot of teams, it's making it very difficult for how do you build a long-term sustainable franchise. And I do think that fans in large part want good teams to stay together. They want some sense of continuity and to be able to have those things. And we've had so much player movement over the last 10, 15 years with free agency and trade requests, et cetera. But this is creating a situation where even the teams that are happy, like we love having this guy, he loves being here, we're all good, even those situations become almost untenable because of the restrictions that these contract situations appeal to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can I have an example? Like maybe do you have one off the top of your head? Because you're describing this, and honestly, all I'm hearing is kind of, with the exception of those older players that are kind of being forced out, and that I'm opposed to. And I think there's a way of tweaking the system so that it can allow for more of those. Aside from that, the way you describe it kind of just sounds like accountability to me. Like in terms of holding these teams accountable, it's like, oh, you're not good at having a developmental system. Well, kind of figure it out then. Like that's what makes you a bad team. That's what has made you historically a bad team, is not being able to have a good coach or make those right decisions. At least maybe I'm looking at this very simplistically, but that's how you're describing it to me. Is bad teams are going to continue to struggle, and they might have to overpay a player like Zach LaVine, and they might continue to suck. Well, guess what? That's kind of why they've been a bad team for a long time, and it's going to continue to affect them in the future.
So I think a better tactic for you would be if I approach it from a player perspective. And the biggest problem I actually have from a player perspective is the middle class is just going to get crushed here.
Yes.
Because you're going to see, teams make the decision of, all right, well, this guy's not an all-star, but he's really important to us, so let's overpay and keep him. But this other guy who's a role player who does the rebounding and defense and is really great for our locker room, he's honestly just not, we just don't have the money. And so those guys are going to get pushed down. We're going to see an elimination of the middle class here, where it's going to be, even though they'll make more money than a lot of the guys ever did in the NBA because of where the salaries are at, but you're going to see their earning potential way lowered as those teams have to make those binary decisions. I think it's going to be, and especially because I think most teams won't make the decision not to pay those maxes and then pay the veteran role players. They won't do that. They'll just go both ways. They'll be like, well, we're not going to pay that. And because we're not going to be as good because we lost that player, we're also not going to pay the middle class, and we're just going to bring salaries in general down. That's kind of the goal of this new CBA, because it's kind of built to be as close to a hard cap as possible. And that, to me, I think is kind of what we're going to see a little bit with the NBA and the player side.
Okay, I understand that. That makes a lot of sense.
I just have to go the player route. That's all I have.
No. Yeah, I know. I'm a softie for them. At the same time, like I'm waiting for that one team to say, okay, a superstar X, you think you deserve $65 million a year? Go get it. In the meantime, role players A, B, C, and D are going to get 4-year deals worth, $80 million a piece, kind of balancing out that money, and will remain competitive. And those contracts, in the words of Pat Riley, are tradable contracts, easier to move, etc. And if at some point a superstar shakes free or is willing to come here, and as we're seeing a lot more players kind of have sign and trade deals as they enter into free agency, you wonder whether or not there's still an avenue of flexibility. I want all the players to get paid as much as possible, and I hate the idea of a team being hard capped. I understand that owners are going to complain, but it's mostly because of their bad decision making and them being greedy. At the same time, if you can find some way to make it a comfortable meeting, which I know is almost impossible, then I'm all for that and exploring that possibility. But it's just, I know. I sound naive just even thinking about it and talking about it, because the reality is, these are hard negotiations that take years, and everybody always winds up complaining about it. But some people say when both sides of the negotiation complain about the final deal, that usually means it's a good deal, because everybody gets kind of screwed to a certain degree, and winds up benefiting everybody to a certain degree too. So we'll see. I'm sure superstar players will probably appreciate the fact that they get more money. Teams are going to lament the fact that they have to pay superstar players, especially if they're aging or not as good, in Brandon Ingram's case perhaps. But there's always going to be complaints and grumbles. Hopefully they can figure out some way of making it better balance for more players.
Two kind of things that are tied into the same team here, as kind of to wrap this up. You kind of mentioned, like, I'm waiting to see one team say, like, go get it. That's what the Clippers did with Paul George. Like, the Clippers absolutely did that with Paul George. Paul George wanted to stay with the Clippers, and now he's in Philadelphia because of that exact situation. And why that's particularly notable is that the one owner, I think, that would actually complain, because you mentioned, like, the owners will be unhappy. I don't think so. The owner's approach has been like, to the teams were complaining about it. The front offices, they were trying to build championship or winning teams were complaining about it. And the owner's response is, yeah, no, that's why we designed it this way. Like, we built it so that we would have to pay less to get salaries down, to control costs. That's why we built it this way. So you're just going to have to deal with it, because that's what we decided to do, because they're the bosses. And the one guy that might object to that is Ballmer. Ballmer was the one that was like, yeah, I don't care. I'll pay 3-4 times whatever the luxury tax is. I want to win a championship. And the fact that his team in particular was the one to make this decision, I think really kind of illustrates how severe the impacts of this are going to be for some teams.
I know we're still in wait and see mode, but isn't that kind of a good thing? Like, they were a really good team, but they almost felt like invariably they were going to be capped in how far they could go, because they've kind of tied their future to two players that had suffered a number of injuries over the course of their careers and missed time and things of that sort, mostly on the Kawhi end. And I understand that completely, but I think it kind of, I don't think it's a bad place for them. Like, for Paul George, like, if he could get that money elsewhere, and he did, obviously, he got it from Philadelphia, it kind of puts him in a much more comfortable role as a number 2 player on the team, or maybe even a number 3 at this point in his career, or as he continues to age. He still gets to compete at a high level. Now he gets to complement Joel Embiid, an MVP type player, Tyrese Maxey, a young up and coming all-star. That's a better place for him to be. And Philadelphia had the money to give him. It works out. And maybe they open up a title window. We have yet to see whether or not that will actually manifest. But from the Clippers side of things, yeah, they were forced to make a hard decision, but it kind of benefited them, because I think tying money to Paul George to be maybe your second or third best player on a championship winning team, and commit that kind of money and not be able to actually secure a championship, because, well, they just have it up to this point. I'm sure they're going to be a fine team without him, and that's a tough place to be in. But I don't know. That's just my sense. I think they're kind of being underrated to a certain degree. I know Ty Lue made some comments recently about that as well, but I don't think it was necessarily a bad thing for them. Yes, they lose a superstar player, but I don't see a lot of grumbling about it. Maybe it's just because the Clippers, and they're always the redheaded stepchild to the Lakers, but at the same time, it was kind of a good decision for them not to have to pay these guys. And I'm sure if they could find a way of getting out of paying Kawhi, they probably would too.
Yeah, Clippers fans feel pretty confident about it. We'll see how that works at midseason, when they're depending on Kawhi Leonard and James Harden to be their leadership in the locker room. Okay, I have more I want to say on this, but we're out of time. Up next, we're going to preview the Southeast Division. We'll go through Team David covers, Miami Heat, as well as the Magic, the Hornets, the Hawks. I'm missing one. Wizards. That's why, because it's the Wizards. Of course, I forgot the Wizards. We'll do that next here on Locked On NBA. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. They got a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I use Game Time all the time. My wife's birthday is this month, and she's a huge Colorado Avalanche fan. And I'm going to be getting tickets through Game Time because I'm able to get the absolute best prices. You toggle on the all-in pricing, and you're not going to get caught off guard with all the other fees and stuff that come into play. It drives me nuts whenever I'm trying to get the best deal I can. And I'm like, oh, these tickets are good. It costs this much. That's within my budget. And then you go to the checkout page, and it's way more than that. Toggling on that feature for the all-in pricing is absolutely huge. You can get seat views with a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. And they got a Game Time guarantee for the lowest price. If not, they'll credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it, David?
It's game time.
We'll be right back on Locked On NBA. Final segment with you here on Locked On NBA for a Tuesday. Glad to have you with us, Matt Moore and David Ramil. Tomorrow you can check out Jake Madison and John Corrales. You got Pat the Designer and Nick Angstadt on Thursdays, and on Fridays, David's partner, Wes Goldberg, and my partner, Adam Mares, on Friday's show. All right, let's do a little Southeast Division quick preview. We've got 6 weeks until the start of the NBA season, David. We are 6 weeks away. And so with that, well, actually 7, but we've got enough time to do all 6 divisions and do these quick kind of previews. So we're going to do it this way. We're going to do the team that we think is going to win, the worst team in the division, and who's going to be frisky. I will let you go first. Who do you think is winning the Southeast Division?
It's a tough one for me because honestly, I think there are 2 teams that probably are pretty clearly above the rest. It's the Orlando Magic, and I would say probably the second best team in the division is the Miami Heat, which I happen to cover. Looking at those 2 teams, they're kind of very, very different. There's so many questions, which we talked about last week regarding the Heat, Jimmy Butler's contract, Bam Adebayo, whether or not he takes a leap this year. Tyler Hero, does he continue to finally, disprove the fans that have all of a sudden turned on him, etc.? There's a lot of questions about Miami. On paper, I would say both teams are pretty even with some weaknesses and obviously a lot of strengths. But Miami could be the best team in the division, but I just feel like Orlando, with the way that they're growing, that the way they've continued to develop, the fact that they had a better record last year, and while you could turn to Miami's roster and say, oh, they were beset by injuries, they had a number of players out, etc., I don't know that that's going to change. And if that's not going to change, then there's no clear pathway for them to win 50-plus games. And I still think Orlando probably winds up being the better team. They made some offseason changes, another year of growth for a really good young core that usually translates into at least a handful more victories, if not more. And that might be enough. It might be closer than we might expect it to be, but I would give Orlando the edge in this case.
I've been doing a lot of gambling work over at my other podcast, Buckets, for the Action Network, and we're doing Southeast Division previews or division previews and best bets. There's a lot of trends that basically say that teams underperform their win total when they're in Orlando's spot. They won 10 more wins than last season, 10 or more wins. Teams that do that go 49, 27, and 2 to the under. Orlando's over-under is 47.5. So if you go under that and you're at 45 wins, now I think you're in real risk of being caught by the Heat. Like that, I think is absolutely possible. My problem with Miami is I'm just like, okay, I think Jaime is going to be better. I do not understand how, because every time I watch him, he's invisible. But Nikola Jovic's advanced metrics all indicate that he's a really impactful player. I don't know what he does great, but he is there and they win his minutes. Like, hey, I'm trying to give him credit. Like, I'm just, the fact that I don't see it as a me problem.
Most backhanded of compliments. Yeah. I don't know how he does well, because every time I see him, he doesn't do anything. But yeah, I guess
he's not bad. I just never see him be like, oh, that was a really great play or possession.
He doesn't play much. He doesn't play much. His minutes are really cut.
But then I look at the rest of the roster and I get that Caleb Martin wasn't great last year, but I still think Caleb Martin's a good NBA player. And he's gone. Kevin Love's a year older. When I really start to get into it, it's tough for me because with Miami, I wind up feeling like, man, okay, Jimmy, to whatever degree he plays, Bam, Tyler, Jaime, Jovic, Love,
Terry Rozier,
Duncan,
Terry
Rozier. Okay. That's 8 guys. And then the rest of the guys, I'm just like, yeah, they're just guys. But that's 8 players out of the rotation. That's pretty solid, right?
Yes,
the problem is if Jimmy misses time or if they have other injuries like they did last year, it really it gets hard. But then they're the zombie Heat and they win these games even when guys are out, because we've talked about their developmental system and how good Spo is. So their floor is very high. That's one of the problems I have is if everything clicks with Orlando, and I'll still say that Orlando's going to win the division, then it's great because it's you have maybe the best defensive backcourt in the league. It's either them or Boston with Jalen Suggs and KCP. Yeah. And then you have Franz, it's impossible for him to shoot worse from 3, I hope. Paolo Banchero, whose efficiency should improve, and a million options at center, and they could trade Wendell Carter Jr. and get another upgrade. I like a lot of these combos and a lot of these opportunities for Orlando, which is why I'll still pick them to win the division. But the floor for Orlando is like 45, 44. If they take a big step backwards, they're going to be in real trouble. And that's kind of where I get to. Who do you think is going to be the worst team in the division?
Also a tough question because you have a perennially bad team in Charlotte that is always looking to be as bad as they possibly can. I know that's kind of unfair, but at the same time, I think maybe they're taking some steps in the right direction. So I don't think they're going to be significantly better, but I think they'll be, not the worst team in the division. So I would have to still give the Wizards the quote unquote credit for that because I don't know what's happening there. I don't know if they have any kind of realistic hope of getting better. They traded a fine young player in Denny Avdija. I don't know. I mean, what's the goal there? What are they trying to accomplish? Are they kind of sort of tanking? Because it feels like they're just good enough to not tank outright and too bad to actually compete for more than 25 wins. So I don't know what the hell's going to happen there, but it doesn't seem like a good situation.
They need to trade like a bunch of guys. Like they need to trade Kyle Kuzma like now, like absolutely, like immediately. Kispert's good. I'd like to see Corey Kispert on a good team. I think he'd be very helpful for a lot of squads. Jordan Poole actually kind of pulled out of a nosedive from the beginning of the season. His back half of the season, it was like the first part of the season, we're like, this is the worst player in the NBA, like the worst starter in the NBA. And then like by the end of the season, it was like, no, like he's not good, but he's fine. I actually like Marvin Bagley quite a bit. He's turned into like a pretty solid veteran. He's one of those guys like there's a bunch of these guys in the late 2000s where they were very highly touted draft. Like Marvin Williams, I think is a good example of this. Guys that went very high in the draft and they never were that guy. But like over time, they just stuck and they became like, oh, he's a perfectly serviceable role player and he helps his team. That's what I feel like Marvin Bagley is kind of on pace to do. That said, like, this roster is terrible. They have no direction. They gave an interim coach. So it has to be the Wizards. I wanted to say the Hawks because I'm very low on Atlanta. Ooh. I just don't understand how like they expect this to be better. All of DeJounte Murray's metrics last year say that he was a negative, but I just do not get that watching him and having seen his career. And I'm just like, what? To me, it's like, okay, you're running it back with the same coach and most of the same roster, except you lost one good player. How is this going to be better? But their floor is so much higher than the Wizards, which I think is like 17 wins. Like, it's going to be bad. And it needs to be. Cooper Flagg's worth it. Ace Bailey's worth it. They need a tank. They need to get an actual franchise player because it does not look like Alex Sarr is that. But we'll see. Give me your frisky team in the division.
Well, to me, it's the fifth team that we haven't talked about, which is the Hawks, because I think we're kind of at a point where we're underrating what Trae Young does and what he's been able to accomplish. I think it was so kind of difficult to amorphous even and trying to incorporate Quinn Snyder's offense and everything else, and then having Murray share the backcourt along with Young, and obviously he went through injuries too. But I think they, while things looked bad on the outside, and certainly you heard enough grumblings, from the inside that maybe things weren't great either, you kind of picked a side. I like that. You pick a side, you stick with Young, he's your guy, and guess what? You can just kind of lean into that, and that's not necessarily a bad place to be. So my thoughts is they're going to be better than expected. They might not be great. They might not even be good, but better than expected to me is what I equate as frisky. Although I kind of think you're going to probably pick the Charlotte Hornets.
I hate how predictable I am because I am picking the Charlotte Hornets. So I have them projected as being absolutely horrible based off of like off-season additions and losses and how they performed last year. However, there are certain teams in certain situations when the chemistry gets so bad that the players no longer have the players that are too young or are not great leaders have no more authority, and you bring in a coach that can have that authority, it can really turn things. And look at Houston last year with Ime Udoka. Charles Lee, the vibes are immaculate. Like the fact that he had his guys, his young players and Grant Williams in Boston hanging out in the locker room during the finals to be like, this is what being around a championship team is like. This is what you can accomplish in your career. That's like a tiny thing that means the absolute world to me.
Yeah.
LaMelo Ball, who I am lower on than almost anyone amongst the NBA intelligentsia, is still a really good, impactful player. He's still a really good offensive player. And with Brandon Miller, if he's willing to acquiesce and you make Brandon Miller the number one, because Brandon was very good last year in terms of like for a rookie and showed a lot by the end of the season. There's a real, like, there is a possibility of the Hornets being a play-in caliber team and being frisky enough to where they're a pain that they'll catch up with you on any given night. It's mostly the coach. It's a little bit the roster. They'll still take on deals if somebody's wants to offload somebody and will give trade assets. They'll do that, and they may get to January and be like, "All right, it's time to pull the plug and go for flag." But I do think that they'll be frisky and they'll be a pain to play way more so than the Hawks or the Wizards. So I will give them the frisky tag amongst these squads.
It's exciting. We'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens. All right, it's going to do it for Locked On NBA. Thanks for joining us. You can catch David over at Locked On Heat. I'm over at Locked On Nuggets. Tomorrow, check out the show with Jake Madison and John Corrales. We'll see you guys again next time here on Locked On NBA.